spotted by two Milwaukee sorry, 1 second. So two Milwaukee detectives spotted these men. They looked suspicious. And so when stopped by the police, Zoller, who was the younger of the two, was apprehended fairly quickly. When questioned about his draft card, he replied in German, "Was dat?" or "What's that?" When asked if he'd served in the German army, he replied in the affirmative and was promptly taken into custody by one of the detectives. Lapel, on the other hand, did not stop for the policeman. He only responded, "1 minute, please," while raising his right hand very dramatically. He repeated this response multiple times while he dodged the police, but he too was taken into custody. When questioned about their escape, Zoller said, quote, "We just wanted to drink some of that famous Milwaukee beer. We heard so much about Milwaukee beer that we wanted to drink it." This, like many other escapes that occurred throughout Wisconsin, was not seen as dangerous. POWs caught outside the camps rarely resisted arrest and returned willingly. They had no desire to escape back to the front lines. Rather, they wished to explore the communities they were staying in. Although the prisoners were returned, this did prompt the 10th District Supervisor, Eugene Warnemont, to push for more safeguards at the field. He called for a special meeting of the county board to guarantee further measures were taken. Warnemont mentioned getting numerous calls from the public concerned after news of the escape attempt was released. Once the camp was operating, reporters noted that PW was printed on the inside and the outside of all the prisoners' clothing. This was likely a precaution taken after the escape attempt because the two men had turned their jackets inside out to hide the big white lettering that said PW on it, identifying them as prisoners. So this way, no matter which way they turned the jacket, you now still knew they were prisoner of war. A worried mother wrote to the newspaper after it ran the article about the escaped prisoners. She expressed concern about security at Billy Mitchell Field, as the prisoners had escaped with only 45 prisoners at the camp. Once the camp was up and running, it intended to hold up to 1,500. She was especially concerned about the safety of neighborhood children, as there were multiple elementary schools around the airport. In addition, she feared another escape attempt, as well as accidents from the increased traffic around the airport, both of which she thought would endanger the children. The mother further expressed her concern over the rushed nature of the camp, which allowed for no feedback from the community, echoing earlier concerns. There was other pushback from city officials. In February 1945, Alderman John Brophy of the 5th Ward appealed to various organizations and the general public for more workers. The Kiekefer plant on Canal Street needed 20 workers, and the positions were to be filled by German prisoners. The alderman worried that the presence of these prisoners would, quote, "create a bad feeling among citizens and patriotic employees," end quote. And therefore, every attempt should be made to appeal to outside sources of labor. The concerns expressed by both the mayor and the alderman proved successful, and it prevented POW labor from being used. The men feared retaliation from neighborhood residents, many of whom still had family in parts of Nazi-occupied Europe. The decision was postponed until the impact of prisoners' presence in the community could be discussed. Nevertheless, it was not long before German POWs were being considered to supplement labor outside of just battery manufacturing. They were sent to work on farms in surrounding communities, as well as other businesses. Some of the prisoners were transported up to Mequon, where they worked in the Herbert A. Nineman Company Fox Ranch and canning factory. Donald Look, the purchasing agent for the company, drove to the airport and selected 50 men for the job. Of the 50, he picked 12 to work with him in the freezer plant. Look got to know these men fairly well, and he described them as real gentlemen. The men he chose spoke some English and were non-commissioned officers. Look asserted that none of them had wanted to fight, but had been drafted despite of their personal opinions of the war. During its operation, Billy Mitchell Field was a base camp for 3 other Wisconsin camps in the area. This meant that prisoners would be processed at Billy Mitchell Field before being sent on to one of the 3 other camps. The other camps were Camp Rockfield, Hartford, and Sturtevant, and they were all acted as branch camps until June 1945. At this time, the battery assembly line at Billy Mitchell Field was discontinued, and this was due to the decrease in demand as the war began winding down in the European front. So at this time, Billy Mitchell Field and its 3 branch camps all reverted to branch camps of Fort Sheridan in Illinois, meaning all prisoners would go through Fort Sheridan before being sent to these camps. The camp during this period had handled over 202,000 batteries and handled over 10 million. Sorry, they assembled 202,000 and they handled 10 million. While operations began winding down, this was not the end of the camp. A few prisoners remained at the post to work in Burlington, packaging evaporated milk, and working at a few other locations. So in September 1945, Fort Sheridan released the total earnings for each Wisconsin camp from January to August of that year. Milwaukee had earned the most, coming in at $265,296, beating out the next closest camp by $40,000. The local farms and businesses that employed German POWs, POW labor, did not pay the prisoners directly. Instead, they paid the U.S. government for the labor. However, under the Geneva Conventions, POWs were given some compensation for their labor by the government. Companies often paid more for the POWs than the POWs would receive, so the government got to pocket any of that extra money. German prisoners were paid with canteen coupons, which they could redeem in the camp. They could buy cigarettes, beer, candy, and other products that were common in American Army canteens. The camp commander had to clear up rumors when interviewed by reporters. He wanted to clarify that Germans could only purchase 1 beer a day, and they were unable to buy any name brand cigarettes. All supplies in the canteens were limited, and therefore certain products were not always available. He did not want Milwaukeeans to think that prisoners were getting special privileges. However, a few months later, in May, the sale of beer, cigarettes, and soft drinks was completely banned from the canteens. While the items had already been in short supply at the various camps, the issue was further exacerbated when tavern keepers and others protested the sale of products to prisoners when civilians were still experiencing shortages of these products. And so the picture you see on the screen is a picture of the canteen at Billy Mitchell Field. You have a POW both working behind the counter and one who's redeeming his coupons that you can see on the counter there, and some of the products in the back that they would be able to purchase through their labor. Other complaints about POW treatment emerged kind of surrounding this issue. One woman took issue with the government rationing and the prisoner camps by proxy. Mrs. Mank from Beaver Dam wrote to the Milwaukee Journal to complain about how the government allowed food to spoil while people suffered from rationing. She argued that German POWs should be given the same poor quality meals that American POWs were receiving in Europe. That way, American citizens could eat the spare ribs and sauerkraut she claimed were being given to the German prisoners. This is likely an over-exaggeration on her part, but it does show the discontent of many citizens over food rationing. The Army eventually did alter the meals provided in the POW camps. It was announced a few weeks after this letter was sent to the Milwaukee Journal that menus in the camp had been cut back for the past few months in order to keep up with civilian rationing. The new regulations urged for more meatless meals and should substitute fish, macaroni, spaghetti, and beans for some of those meat options. Delicacies like butter, cheese, jelly, fruit had not been present in prisoner meals for a while, and the article announcing the change emphasized that POWs were not being coddled. Many of the guards were overseas veterans and therefore would not be soft on the very soldiers they had been fighting. We will see that was not quite the case. Did not work out how they wanted it to. This did not end complaints about lenient treatment. Another housewife wrote a letter to the Milwaukee Journal a few months after this and complained about her lack of access to meat. Her husband, a defense laborer, who worked 10 to 16 hours a day and had to make do with cold meals despite her best effort to have a hot meal when he arrived home. She resented the German POWs for eating hot meals with their lunches while American workers had to go without. So who were these men? Most of the POWs were captured in the North African campaign and been under the command of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. However, this was not the case for all of the prisoners. If we remember our two friends from the escape, Lapille and Zoller had escaped from Billy Mitchell Field, but they themselves had been captured in the German retreat of Rome in Italy. Lapille specifically had served in the Eastern Front fighting in Stalingrad and Finland, and he had been wounded 5 different times. So there's different campaigns brought different prisoners to these camps, and it's also very unclear the ideological conviction of these POWs who were held in Milwaukee. There was likely a spectrum of beliefs. The camp commander asserted that no fights had occurred between hardcore Nazis and the average German soldier. That comment would indicate that there might have been a varying beliefs in the camp. He also stated that by March 1945, the majority of soldiers understood that Germany was going to lose the war. So you see some of the pictures. These are, I believe they're on the back of a work truck, the POWs taking a break from work. We also see that in April, the army announced that the Nazi salute would be forbidden in the POW camps. They would now have to do the traditional right-hand salute with the elbow bent. The straight arm salute was the official salute of the German army, so therefore had been previously permitted, but in April it was completely banned. Additionally, prisoners who died in the United States would be given a funeral with full military honors, but they would not receive the Nazi flag or any of the Nazi ceremonies. While the reasoning was not explicitly mentioned, this policy change occurred a few weeks after the British liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and this was the first camp to be liberated by the Western forces, and therefore the West's first exposure to the full extent of Nazi atrocities, and may explain why this policy was instituted only a month before the war ended. So this is a really interesting picture, which shows one of the prisoners doing the Nazi salute. He's on the far right, but if you look towards the center, like 2 men back, you see someone doing the bent arm salute. So we don't know exactly when this picture was taken, other than it was taken in 1945. So whether it's before or after April, if it's before, then you know why he's allowed to do that salute. If it's after, this man is actively disobeying an order given at the camp. Although that policy was through all of the different camps. But the German POW experience was vastly different from American POW's experience. Around the same time, 26 American soldiers were brought home after being imprisoned by the Germans. 9 of the men were from the Milwaukee area. Captain John Lorenzo from West Dallas described the poor conditions of the German camps. He complained the food they were given was soup made out of weeds, and the Americans were allowed to work for food, but less than 2% volunteered. Recreation such as baseball was offered to the soldiers, but the men were often too weak or too tired to participate. In the final weeks before liberation, the Gestapo attempted to rob the POWs of anything valuable that they had on them. The experience of German and American POWs was extremely different, and therefore understandable that the disparity caused discontent amongst those most directly affected by the war. It is for this reason that the presence of Nazi soldiers disturbed many women in the community. A woman who served in the Women's Army Corps wrote to the newspaper after visiting her family. She expressed dismay over the comfortable treatment of that the prisoners were receiving. She claimed that they were left unguarded and that Wisconsinites had invited prisoners to their homes for dinner. And I didn't find specific accounts in Milwaukee, but in the rest of the state, this was very true. And her outrage was derived from her experience working in the Army hospitals. She wrote, quote, "I wish the Wisconsin people who are so kind to our captured enemies could walk through the wards of this hospital or any of the many other Army or Navy hospitals in this country or overseas and see these young American boys with arms or legs or eyes missing, with faces distorted by the wounds of battle, boys whose charts give their age as 19 or 20, but whose faces are tired and so worn, you find it nearly impossible to believe," end quote. She asserted that if people saw these American boys, they would not be so indulgent towards the German prisoners. Other Wisconsinites commented that justifying their treatment of the enemy, saying they hoped that Germans would treat American POWs the same if the situation was reversed. Outrage also came from a Milwaukee mother who had seen images of American soldiers held in the German prison camp of Limburg. She was horrified by the mistreatment of American men, describing their bodies as skeletons. The woman then juxtaposed the images of these camps with the treatment of German prisoners held in America. She said, quote, "Do you blame me or any other mother for saying that if the prisoners were treated only half as bad as ours are there, the Germans would quit sooner? They wouldn't call themselves the master race," end quote. She was worried about her son, who at the time was actively serving in the European theater. U.S. servicemen did come into contact with prisoners at the Milwaukee camp. In addition to using the airport to house migrant laborers and German prisoners, the Army also used the military barracks at the hospital, as a hospital. They sure were getting their money's worth out of their lease. There was only about 50 patients at the hospital at any given time. The majority of cases were American soldiers who had fallen ill on furlough in Milwaukee and were unable to be transported to Fort Sheridan in Illinois. The POWs were sometimes patients in the hospital, but a few who were medical students prior to the war served as medical assistants in this makeshift hospital. Occasionally, they even helped out during surgeries. I'm not sure how the soldiers must have felt about being operated with the assistance of German prisoners. One of the recuperating American soldiers was Carl Mueller Jr., who had cut his foot on a broken bottle while visiting home. He was sent to the hospital at Billy Mitchell Field, where he spent the week recuperating. He would eat in the same mess hall as POWs, and he was amazed at their treatment. He remembered them eating over half a loaf of bread with their meals. Additionally, Mueller visited the local bars near the airport. He would recognize the familiar faces of privileged German prisoners who were allowed to visit the local bars for a drink. Mueller commented, "Those POWs sure had it made, as I'm certain they would have never had it so good in the German army." And so the picture we have here is a picture of what the mess hall looked like. The military police or soldiers who were at the camp would eat in the same mess hall in separate spaces, so they'd be sitting at different tables. And they did have separate food, but it was of the same quality per the Geneva Conventions. And you can see one of the prisoners kind of standing in the back for the picture as well. Additionally, it's very likely some of the guards at the camp were former prisoners of the Reich. In April 1945, it was announced that 5 former American POWs would be assigned guard duty at one of the branch camps operating in either Illinois, Wisconsin, or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was common for former prisoners of war to be assigned to military police duty in one of the POW camps in order to serve out the remainder of their enlistment. Despite pushback, the military was more concerned about Wisconsinites becoming too friendly with the prisoners. In late July 1945, the military reiterated its non-fraternization policy for all of the Fort Sheridan branch camps. They warned that prisoners would be removed from work if managers were too lenient in their treatment of Germans. The order was given after violations of the non-fraternization policy were reported, and in one case, a civilian was fired due to its violation. Harry Hertz, a former German prisoner at Billy Mitchell Field, remembered that once a month he and 4 other prisoners were invited to the home of George Tesch for a Sunday dinner. The prisoners worked on the farm during the week and therefore were invited to dinner on the weekend. The prisoners enjoyed a Christmas party thrown by the Tesch family. Decades later, Hertz still remembered enjoying the delicious food and the beautifully decorated house. This was not the only celebration that POWs were allowed to take part in. A banquet was organized in late November of 1945, after the growing season was done. All of the employers of the POWs were invited to Mitchell Airport and served food prepared by the prisoners. Donald Look, the man who got the POWs for Mequon, recalled it as some of the finest food he had ever eaten, and he ate confections baked by one of his POW friends and listened to an orchestra led by another. Now, this picture I do not believe was taken at that banquet, but you can see some of the POWs who would be working in the kitchen because they could be employed on base itself doing different duties at the camp. You can also see some of that large lettering. One of the men even has PW on his apron, so not to kind of sneak off and hide the lettering under the apron. Some family members of POWs were able to visit those being held at the camp. Joseph Haas, who had immigrated to the United States in the 1920s, had moved to Milwaukee to work during the war. He discovered that his cousin Louis, who had remained in Germany, was also in Milwaukee. Louis had served in the German army and was captured by Allied forces and then imprisoned at the airport. Joseph gained permission to visit his cousin during his stay in Milwaukee. The visits occurred in the recreation area, and Joseph brought packages that contained cigarettes, cookies, candy, and other goodies. So even after that ban, they were finding ways to get those cigarettes into the camp. The Red Cross also published the names of Europeans seeking information about their relatives who had immigrated to the United States. But the notices also included family members seeking information about German prisoners interned at Milwaukee. The prisoners continued to intrigue Wisconsinites, including children. Jerry Zimmerman remembered visiting the Wisconsin State Fairgrounds, where German prisoners were helping to can and process fresh produce. Occasionally, the American guards would allow the children to talk to the prisoners without supervision. So much for them being harsh on their former enemies. He recalled how the children were surprised the Germans looked nothing like the terrible men they'd seen in propaganda images. Looking back, Zimmerman was surprised that their parents were not more concerned about their children interacting with these German prisoners. Additionally, some young women had taken an interest in the POWs. One of the ladies remembers visiting a creek in South Milwaukee near Badger Malleable Foundry. One day, she and her friend found the German prisoners on the other side of the creek, trying to cool down. The girls attempted to chat with the men, not realizing that they could not understand them. The girls would sneak baked goods and fresh fruit to bring to the POWs. Only one prisoner would venture across the creek to accept the goods and bring them back to the other side to share. Other women wanted to flirt with the Germans as payback. One Milwaukee woman seemed a bit jealous of the attention German Fräuleins were receiving and wrote into the newspaper. She argued that if American boys could flirt with German girls, why shouldn't American girls flirt with German prisoners who were in America? She proposed that all the lonely girls throw a big party for the Germans and pictures could be sent back to the men in Europe. While she ends the letter, making it clear she's not serious. She does view possible infidelity as a more pressing issue than the presence of POWs, especially after the war had ended. Camp Billy Mitchell included a fenced-in area for recreation. The POWs liked to play soccer, handball, and even ping pong. Some prisoners were even allowed to own dogs within the camp. There were 4 or 5 in total, all which could roam freely and had a pretty friendly demeanor. Other POWs spent their time reading or writing. Prisoners also had access to art supplies, and finished paintings were hung in their recreation room. Eventually, there was enough art that the Army created an exhibit of the prisoners' art in the administration building at Mitchell Field. This was open to the public. All of the materials were purchased by POWs using their canteen coupons, and the subjects of these paintings varied from portraits of mothers and sisters to landscapes. Some of these landscapes hinted at battles that the men had seen, depicting places like Holland, France, Libya, and Italy. The exhibits also contained wood carvings. Some of these paintings were sold to members of the public, and any money earned went to replenishing the art supplies in the canteen. However, these artistic endeavors could only occur when German POW labor was not needed. There were other opportunities for the POWs to spend their earnings. The camp would put on a movie once a week, and prisoners could use part of their canteen coupons to buy admissions. One Milwaukee girl remembered accidentally sneaking into one of these movies at Billy Mitchell Field. She lived across the street from the airport, and she remembered seeing the barracks from her house. One day, the gate to the airport was open, and the 9-year-old walked in. She found a movie being shown in one of the buildings and decided to stay and watch. Her mother was furious when she found out where her daughter had been, and the little girl never wandered back to the airport while the camp was active. In addition, the camp offered classes on subjects such as English and mathematics. The classes offered to the POWs were likely part of the German re-education effort in these prison camps. The Army wanted to instill American ideals and traditions in order to combat the indoctrination they had received from the Nazis. One goal of the re-education courses was to teach tens of thousands of Germans how to read and write English. The Army hoped that the educated prisoners would spread American values once they returned home to Germany. In addition to lessons on English and American history, the Germans were also shown images of Nazi atrocities. The Army understood that not every soldier would be converted by American ideals, but they hoped that it would influence the vast majority. Some of the German prisoners were trained for civil servant positions, such as police officers for the occupation government in Germany. The English classes allowed the former German prisoners to easily communicate with Allied forces and the military government they had instituted. You can see an image here of one of the POWs doing laundry, hanging that out to dry. This is likely in the recreation area, and again, you can see kind of PW written on the pants in various fashions. Robert Held, who was a guard at the camp, emphasized how relaxed security at the camp had gotten by 1946. He said that there were only about 30 American guards in charge of 2,300 prisoners. Roll calls were ineffective because they never got the same count twice. Occasionally, someone would bring in a drunken POW who the guards failed to notice was missing. It was late March 1946 when the Army announced the close of Milwaukee's POW camp. When the camp officially closed, it was only housing around 50 Germans at that time. At its peak, the airport had held over 3,000 prisoners. That is twice as many as it originally was intended to hold. According to Held, when the camp closed, the Army went out with a bang. They brought in a military band, and the German prisoners were given a military send-off. So this image looks like, I'm thinking from the brick building on the side, these men are walking back from the hangar where they were doing battery manufacturing back to their barracks. You can see the one guard kind of in the back following all of these POWs. So at the end of the war, all of the POWs were told that they would be returning to Germany, despite requests by some Germans to remain. This would not turn out to be an easy process for many of the returning Germans. The POWs would not be transported directly back to Germany. Instead, they would either be sent to Britain or France. Those who arrived in Europe through France often had the money given to the POWs for their labor confiscated. They were also put to work for another 2 to 3 years before returning home. The French forced former POWs to work with no pay and with little food instead of sending them on to Germany. Hans Gies, one of the 12 POWs that Donald Look worked with, wrote him upon his return to Europe. He described that he was being held in France for an unknown duration and forced to work. The lack of food was not explicitly mentioned in the letter, but the German noted he had lost 30 pounds since he arrived in France. As a prisoner, he struggled to get word to his parents that he was alive. Eventually, he was able to get a letter to them via another POW who had successfully arrived home to Vienna, Austria. He remained a prisoner in France at least until May 1947, a whole 2 years after the war had ended. If a POW arrived in England, they were often detained for re-education purposes, similar to what they experienced in America, and then sometimes pressed into labor for 1 to 2 years. However, this was a much easier process than in France. Once a POW returned to Germany, in many cases, there was still problems to be faced. Some returned to a Soviet-occupied East Germany, only to be arrested and never seen again. Even in West Germany, returning POWs found it hard to find work. While it's unknown how many former German POWs returned to Wisconsin, more than 5,000 returned to the United States after the war. Even Germans who remained in Germany were still connected to those they had met back in Wisconsin. Donald Look kept in contact after the war, sending the Germans letters. While Look's messages were never received, likely due to French censorship, he received letters, Christmas cards, and even a wedding announcement from Germany. Another man from Grafton, Albert Neufeld, who also worked side by side with the German prisoners. After the war, Neufeld and his wife visited one of his former prisoners, Kurt Buttner, in his hometown of Oberkochen, Germany. Neufeld was gifted memento items from Buttner, including his POW coat, German Army belt buckle, and his mountain cap. Their experiences working together during the war created a friendship that lasted the entirety of their lives. Other chance encounters showed that Milwaukee had a lasting impact on some of the prisoners. In 1963, a Milwaukee man was sitting with some friends at a train depot in France. They were approached by a man who had heard them speaking English. He inquired about where they were from, and the Milwaukee man replied. When he did, this other man became very excited. He took off his jacket and showed him a tattoo that spelled Milwaukee. It turned out the man was a former POW from Billy Mitchell Field. Even close to 20 years later, that man could list almost every bar along Greenfield Avenue. Billy Mitchell Field was open for less than a year and a half, yet the camp made a huge impact on Wisconsin's economy by using POW labor to fill labor shortages. Despite initial concerns and a few early escape attempts, Many in Milwaukee and its surrounding communities found a way to make lasting peace with their enemies. It is a unique and intriguing part of Wisconsin's home front history. And then, oh wait, I can talk about this photo really quick. So this is inside one of the bunkhouses. It looks very much like a military barracks. And again, that just kind of reiterates they're trying to give equal treatment to how a soldier would be taken care of versus how a POW would be taken care of. And you can see some of the book, he's holding a book that was available to him for recreation. But yeah, and then I know we'll have time for questions, but also if you guys want to learn more, I do research into all of the different camps in Wisconsin, and I have 2 podcast episodes on it. So if you want, check out my podcast, Badgerland Journal at Stories of Wisconsin. Or if you have questions that you think of after this, I have an email, badgerlandjournal@gmail.com. And now I can answer questions.
Thank you so much, Abby, for such an interesting and informative presentation. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll do those first, and then I'll open up the floor to anyone who wants to verbalize a question. The first question was a bit of a technical one. Please, again, what year did Milwaukee County first get involved with the prisoner of war camps?
So it was January 1945 is when this was proposed, and the camp lasted until I believe March. I can look back, March 1946. So it was a little over a year.
Thank you. Kitty asks, do you have a document with dates and facts you're referring to in the presentation or a transcript?
I have a script that I was writing, and most of the information that I used came from the Milwaukee Journal or the Milwaukee Sentinel, which at the time was 2 different publications. I also use Betty Cowley's Stalag, Wisconsin. She did dozens of interviews about different various camps. So some of the more anecdotal evidence that I was using came from interviews she conducted. Yeah, so for this presentation, those were the documents I was referring back to. Also, the Milwaukee County Historical Society has the Donald Look collection. His daughter put together information, so I also referenced that in this material as well.
It looks like we have one more question in the chat. Do you know, was there a German POW camp in Genesee, Wisconsin?
Yes, I believe there was. I haven't done a ton of extra research into that, but I know Betty Cowley does a little bit of a synopsis for each one. But I do believe there was one located there because, like I said, there's 39 different camps in the state, I believe.
And then one final text question. What was the name again regarding Stalag?
So it's Stalag, Wisconsin. And then here, actually, let me type that into this chat. So it's Stalag, Wisconsin by Betty Cowley, just so then it might be easier for people to see the spelling of both Stalag and Betty Cowley.
Excellent. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to jump on audio, and if you're not able to unmute yourself, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Hi, Abby. It's Dan in Milwaukee on Marquette's campus, as a matter of fact. My mother's sister's husband, which would be my uncle, Mickey Finn, John Orville Finn, and his brother were both POWs caught in the Battle of the Bulge. And Mickey Finn would reiterate that their treatment was not like what the German POWs experienced in Milwaukee. Mickey had some recollections. He also said it was nothing like Hogan's Heroes on TV. So I can lend that. I asked about the dates of operation because my father's uncle, my great uncle, John Beeman, was a county supervisor at the time. And I want to look into some of the genealogy and the facts surrounding that. I think he was in charge, like the treasurer of the county, if you will. So I'm sure he was involved in some of the operations. In fact, his name appears on a plaque at the airport to this day. Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to sign out here. And again, Abby, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you for coming. The only thing I will say, I didn't use it in this presentation, but UW-Madison has some information on the POW camps and specifically regarding Billy Mitchell Field. So you might want to try and look there because I know it has some of the more technical aspects that may be helpful. I don't know his name specifically, so I couldn't tell you, but you might want to check that out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good day.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Abby, this is Patrick Mullins. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Hey, in the American Revolution, there were German prisoners in Pennsylvania decided to stay in Pennsylvania and marry American women. That you cited an example of revenge flirting, but other than that, did you run into any cases of like multiple cases of fraternization between German POWs and Wisconsin women, and did any of them lead to lasting relationships? You mentioned lasting friendships, but
So I didn't find any that guarantee a lasting relationship. There was a woman in Fond du Lac who was arrested for infidelity. So there was more going on there at times. I don't know quite sure, like I haven't looked into it to find out more beyond what the newspaper reported. But it kind of, not to justify it, but it kind of makes sense of all of the young men are now at war, and now you bring in a bunch of young men from Germany, that there might be a little bit of flirting going on. I do know that there are people who came back to Wisconsin. I think the probably most well-known was Kurt Peckman. He was at the Hartford camp, so one of the branch camps of Billy Mitchell. He married someone here, has children who are now like near Lodi, Wisconsin. So there were relationships. I'm assuming that he met his wife here. I don't know for sure, but I do know that there were men who came back here. There are a couple of anecdotal evidence. We just don't know how many came back here. I also know of prisoners who were here that like were in Wisconsin camps that went to visit relatives in like Pennsylvania and stuff, that they would come back to the United States and often go if they had family members where those family members were.
thanks, Abby. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
Abby, this is Jim Miller talking. Thank you very much for your presentation. During the war, my father was a farmer in northwest Milwaukee County, Granville Township. 107th and Bradley Road is where the farm was located. And through his county agent, he was able to get 4, 5, 6 prisoners of war to come up to the farm to help with hoeing, with harvesting. And he would take his truck down to Mitchell Field, and he would load them up in the back of the truck and then drive them back to Granville. And a question I asked him, I said, well, was there anyone guarding them during that time? And he said, yes. And I never got a clear answer. My understanding was that he was had the prisoners in the back of the truck. He was driving, and it must have been quite a drive to go from Mitchell Field up to Granville. And that the guards followed in another vehicle. And I was wondering if you have any information on that.
I don't have any specific information. I do know like they were supposed to be guarded occasionally. I think when it was less prisoners, depending on how many guards you had, they would sometimes be left unsupervised, but obviously you had whoever was working on the farm. The only thing I really know about that is like there's some cases where the soldier or like the guards would get bored just standing there and they would join in with the work because they didn't just want to sit around and watch. But
yes,
sometimes
my father said that very same thing.
Yeah, because I'm sure it gets boring just sitting there watching it, and you're like, I might as well take part. I don't know anything because sometimes, I guess the thing is sometimes they were transported by like private vehicles, and then sometimes they would be transported by like military trucks. I think it just would depend on the size and how many people they were transporting.
For my father and my grandmother, at that time, it was a very positive experience. In fact, with the guards, my dad related that talking to the prisoners, and he and my grandmother were both fluent in German and English, that he learned that at the camp they had a band and they had been given band instruments that they could use. The problem was they didn't have the most current music. And so they asked my dad if he knew of a music store, and he knew of one on Wisconsin Avenue. And they convinced him that they should swing through downtown Milwaukee and stop at the music store. And I said, but they didn't have any money. He said, well, my dad said, I gave him the money to buy the music. I said, anything else? He said, yeah, I probably should have told the guards that were following us that we were detouring through downtown Milwaukee.
Yeah. Like I said, it's very, I think that there was an attempt to have a more secure and I don't know what the word is, more strict camp, but it kind of there's a lot of instances of things like that occurring, and no one seemed to get too worked up about it.
Yeah. My dad said it was a chance for Milwaukee to show its best to these prisoners of war.
Yeah, I think that's a great sentiment.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your sharing the story and your question.
Hi, this is Bill Fliss from Marquette. Great presentation. To comment and a question. The comment is regarding POWs that return to the area. Those of us who are old enough to remember Ernie von Schledorn, the car dealer on Main Street in Menominee Falls, with his thick German accent. Who do you know wants to buy a car? Reportedly, he was a POW during the war who settled in the area after the war. My question is, I was really fascinated by the idea that they were using the courses in the camp to almost indoctrinate these Germans to take a place in post-war Germany. Do you have any more information on that, or is that something that was significant? There were a lot of prisoners, but any sense that there were enough of them to have made a difference, or to have actually been a tangible group back in Germany after the war?
So there is a book which I can get to you. It's called like Barbed Wire College. And so it looks at it. I think there are some mixed reviews on how successful it was. I do think it was probably successful at teaching English, which I think was helpful in the post-war Germany. There's questions about how well the indoctrination or reverse indoctrination, however you want to put it, worked. I think that one's a little bit more questionable. But I do think that they were taking advantage of the classes, especially speaking English. Although I know there was one comment, I think by the camp commander, who's like, they know more English than they want to let on sometimes. Sometimes they would use the, what are you saying? To try and get out of things, or kind of maybe get away with things they wouldn't if the commander knew for sure they spoke English.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? No? Thank you again, Abby, for such a great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think everyone else did too.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming and listening.
Have a great weekend.